Welcome to the Real Bible Rob podcast. Today, I will talk about Jesus being a lawbreaker. And one of the ways that you can really kind of smoke out religious bullies is by talking about this subject of Jesus breaking the law, whether he is sinless, and whether and what aspects of the law apply to us today. And in Jesus' world, he was a big lawbreaker, actually, according to the scribes and Pharisees. But we know and we believe that Jesus was on the right side of the kingdom of heaven. So, wait, how do you do this? How do you say that Jesus breaks the law, which is the definition of sin, according to, according to Judaism, according to the Torah? And then you can say, well, then, and Jesus is sinless. Well, there's a lot to it here. And like I said, I think it's one of the things that is probably the most difficult challenge, one of the most difficult challenges in Christianity today is we pick and choose which laws we follow. We have different ideas about what the law means to us. We have people trying to put 10 commandments in classrooms without really understanding what they are and what they do, and also about the new covenant and where does the new covenant sit in all of this. So let's get started right off the bat here. So definitely Jesus broke the law, right? It says so in a number of places. First of all, in John 5:18, he broke the Sabbath, and he did this explicitly. And then he did it again when his disciples picked grain on the Sabbath in Matthew 12:1. Now, if you think it's only about the Sabbath and, maybe there's some differences there, well, Jesus touched the leper in Matthew 8:3. That's against Torah, absolutely. Jesus was made unclean by this, and then he continued to do his ministry even though he was unclean. This is definitely breaking the law, absolutely. Now, Jesus says in Matthew 12:10, he says, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? As a response to the Pharisees. So you look at this and you go, well, wait a minute. I thought Jesus was sinless, as it says in Hebrews 4:15. And, that's something we totally believe in, right? That Jesus is without sin. We have to kind of go in, what does that mean, right? And what is sin? Now, I've spoken in another podcast about sin versus being in corporate or being individual. What does it mean to be lawless or been in lawlessness, which is sin, versus breaking the law? There are two different things. And that small little difference there is a big dividing point with a lot of people. Like I said, you can really smoke out the religious bullies by talking this way. When you talk about Jesus breaking the law and what is the law and what laws apply to us. Now, I have a couple of examples of that recently. I said this in a short video on Instagram. I said that Jesus broke the law, and I gave the verses that I just spoke to you about. And the one young man who goes to Patrick Henry College, and I'll talk about that in a second. But he's just um, goes, no, this is not true. You're not a real minister, right? And he quotes Matthew 5:17 through 19 as his example. And this is a kind of reveals a lot about this what is dominionist way of looking at the law and the way of looking at Christianity. Dominionism is the idea that we should live in a society, that we should use the government to enforce biblical law, and basically it's the idea of a theocracy, and uh, and of course, just like the Pharisees, they don't just mean the law. They mean their version of the law that is punitive and is according to their interpretation. So anyway, this young man comes after me and he says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one iota, not one yod in Hebrew, one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven, but whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven." So when this young man quotes this to me, he's basically saying, this is an exception. Because I said, wait a minute, this is in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. And the Sermon on the Mount overall is about saying that the legalism of the Pharisees and the scribes does not save you. That is the overall theme here. It's only by grace that you're saved. It's by the application of the new covenant that you're saved. And that's what really Jesus is saying. But people pick this one out. They pick out especially John 7. and and the whole idea of the narrow gate and wolf in sheep's clothing and all of that. I won't go on that here, but it's the same idea, and that is that forget the rest of the narrative, forget the rest of the story of the Sermon on the Mount, and let's just pick out these few verses to say, you must follow the law. Now, the young man was quite rude, and I later found out that the reason why he's rude is he comes from, like I said, from Patrick Henry College, which is the epicenter of dominionism in suburban Washington, D.C. This is if you're part of the Heritage Foundation or you're part of that sort of very right-wing, we need to clamp down, we need to have biblical government people, dominionists. That's what dominionists are. Dominionists basically want to have theocratic influence over everyone and want the laws to comport to the Bible. Well, anyway, and that's where if you're wealthy and you are a fellow at the Heritage Foundation or any one of a number of think tank type people, where do you send your kids? You send them to Patrick Henry College. So, but the reason why this is really, really important in that this is influencing our politics, this is influencing our Christianity relentlessly nowadays. This idea that grace, that the Sermon on the Mount, that these other ways in which the new covenant are shown in the New Testament aren't good enough. No, so he pulled this passage out, which sounds very tough to say there's an exception here. Grace has an exception. That compassion, empathy, all of the things that we hope for in Christianity are only good up to a point, and then here, no, that Jesus is still a hard-nosed guy, right? He's not going to let you get away with anything. And then in the end here, in verse 20, which he didn't quote, says, "For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." This is the same as the idea of the narrow gate. You cannot come to the kingdom of heaven except through the narrow way, the narrow gate. Jesus is saying it's impossible because the scribes and the Pharisees were in the letter of the law, and they prided themselves in not breaking any of the Levitical laws in the Torah. So this idea that this verse somehow says, okay, there's grace, but you've got to still comport to the law is a complete misreading of this. I'll speak about this some other time, but this is part of a big problem in biblical studies, is that, and you really see it in Romans. Romans is probably the worst example of this, is that people will take small pieces like this without looking at the grand argument. If you look at the Sermon on the Mount from beginning to end, with the idea of understanding that Jesus has come to fulfill the law and create a new covenant in him, you see that the Sermon on the Mount is a grand argument against the very thing that he's pointing out here. He's saying if you're going to be a Pharisee or a scribe and look at the kingdom of heaven in the way that they do, something to achieve, something to get into, earning your way to heaven, then you can't do it. They can't do it. That's what this is saying. So let's get back to then the idea of what is Jesus a lawbreaker? Now you'll hear a lot of equivocation about this. You'll see this all over in social media, or I mean in like Google. If you Google anything about this, you'll get the Got Questions and the Gospel Coalition and the Ligner Ministries and Desiring God. They'll all pop to the top of your feed. And they'll all say, well, no, Jesus really didn't break the law. And they'll give all these reasons why. No, that's nonsense. He absolutely does. It says that right there. He broke Levitical law. And he broke it time and time and time again. So you go, wait a minute, but breaking the law is sin. How is that? Well, this is one of those conundrums that people have to understand. So let's look at John 5 for a second, because this is one of those places where you really see it. And it pops up all the time. And like I said, when you go to these Google searches and you see this, you see, oh, they'll bring up John 5. Well, John 5 verse 9 says, at once the man was made well. And then he took up his mat and he began to walk. This was Jesus healing the paralytic man. And now that the day was a Sabbath, so Jesus said to the man who had been cured, it is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful, or the Jews said to the man, it is not lawful for you to carry your mat. But the man said, this man made me well, and he said to me, take up your mat and walk. So they asked him, who is the man that said to you, take it up and walk? Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had disappeared into the crowd. Later Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, see, you have been made well. Do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse happens to you. This is also really important too. One of the very few places in the Gospels where Jesus uses the word sin, hamartia, is here for the paralytic man. And he said, and notice he says, it's not, do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse happens to you. In other words, he's saying, don't do this, don't get in trouble. And I've spoke about this before as well. The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. Therefore, the Jews started persecuting Jesus because he was doing such things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, my Father is still working and I am working. In other words, I'm breaking the law. And he's saying, I'm doing it because the Father says so. This is where people will say things like, oh, well, the Jesus wasn't really breaking the law. Well, no, he is breaking the law. He's just saying that he has the allowance to break the law. He is right in breaking the law. And we'll talk about that a little bit too. And then verse 18, for this reason, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because he was not only breaking the Sabbath, a declarative statement, breaking the Sabbath, but also calling God his own Father, thereby making himself equal to God. So he was flagrantly, in their eyes, breaking the law. Now you could say, well, is he allowed to break the law? Whatever. Well, Jesus claims that, well, the Father's working. I can work too, right? There's another part of this, though, is that when it was the idea of keeping the Sabbath and not working was to honor the day for God, and that it was meant as a day of rest for the people. And then but to say that you can't be good or do good on the Sabbath is not against the intent of the law. So this is where this becomes a real challenge. Jesus breaks the law, absolutely, does over and over again, according to um, Jewish tradition, according to the Torah, he sins. This is sin. But we're told that Jesus is sinless, especially in the book of Hebrews, because it's about intent. It's about, you can't just, it's not just the act, it's the intent. What are you doing it for? This is an example of the letter of the law versus the intent of the law. And this is one of those big things about our culture is, we want people, we want to be law and order culture. We want people to follow the letter of the law. But we also, if we have grace and understanding of why the law is there and what it's about, then it's not sinful to, quote, break the law, but it is sinful to be lawless. So a great example would be, say, nonviolent protesting. Uh, Martin Luther King Jr. Talked about that a lot, Gandhi, others like that, Nelson Mandela. If you're, these are cases, they definitely break the law. And in fact, they do it willfully and on purpose. Perhaps Jesus did too in these ways. He willfully touched the leper. That he did that on purpose. Now, did he do it to provoke other people? We don't know. Maybe he might have. But the thing is that we can say that breaking the law in that case was not a sin because he was doing the intent of the law. The intent of the law is to protect people, to cause, make a better life for people, to make it so that they can be healthy, that they can be closer to God. That's what the purpose of that law is, those laws are. In the same way, in civil laws today, why did Martin Luther King Jr. break the law flagrantly, openly? He did it because the intent of the law was to protect the people, and it wasn't protecting the people. There was massive injustice to do that. So you have to think about Jesus in that same way. A lot of the times when people talk about the law, and that you need to be, uh, uh, you need to follow the law, or there are exceptions to grace. That's what this is. Now, I think what made this young man I was talking about most uncomfortable, and some others do it, is that I talked about that it completely misses the point when you hear this equivocation about, well, Jesus didn't really break the law, and, Jesus is perfect and all that stuff. And I said Jesus fulfilled the law and made it obsolete. That's where people get upset. Well, he didn't really make the law obsolete, but he did is he made the old covenant law obsolete. In other words, the strict adherence to the law. He made that obsolete. We're told that in Hebrews 8. It's just explicitly there. That's what we're told. And then, so why do people work so hard to act like Pharisees? Well, Pharisees, people were afraid of the Pharisees. There's a number of cases of where people would hide what they really thought, would be afraid to speak out because they were afraid of the Pharisees being tattletales. And that's what they were. They were professional tattletales. Now, they had no, Pharisees themselves, the scribes themselves, had no, what would you say, temporal power. They didn't have power over the military. They couldn't arrest people. They couldn't do anything. But the temple hierarchy, who could do those things, and the Romans, who could arrest people and execute them, they did have that temporal power, and they used the Pharisees and the scribes as their tattletales, as their secret police in a way, but working behind the scenes and things like that. So people were in desperate fear about this? Hmm. Sounds a little familiar when we think about totalitarian regimes in our time, and we think about the rise of potentially fascism in our time. Is that telling on people, exposing them as enemies, can get you thrown out of the synagogue, excommunicated, can make you get into deep, deep trouble. That's what their society was like. So that whenever anybody tries to be a Pharisee in our world, and I would definitely put this young man from Patrick Henry College the uh, um, and the Heritage Foundation and other dominionist organizations, I would definitely put them in the same category as the Pharisees because they're doing the same sort of things. They're trying to control people using scripture, using religion. Anyway, Galatians 5:14 says that the law can be summed up in one commandment. You must love your neighbor as yourself. So to me, that's quite simple, isn't it? Anything that is unloving is sin. Anything that is loving cannot be sin. In other words, the letter of the law can be sin or not sin, depending on intent, whether it's a loving action or not. Now, some people will say, oh, well, I'm being sinful by condemning you. Or I'm being loving by condemning you. You hear that a lot, especially from Calvinists. And that's just, it's nonsense. It's gaslighting, really. What they're saying is, I have the right to control you with my love of you. You hear that all the time. You're saying, it's loving for me to correct you. And yes, it is. And it's loving to hold people to account. Yes, absolutely. But it's not loving to bash people with the law. And that's what they really do. It's not that they're trying to help you. No, they're trying to control you. Big difference. So I think 1 John 3:5 is one of those verses that kind of helps us with this. Because in 1 John 3, starting with verse 4, it says, everyone who commits a sin is guilty of lawlessness. Sin is lawlessness. Big difference, right? Not necessarily breaking the law, but being lawless. You know that he was revealed to take away sins, and in him there is no sin. No one abides in him sins. No one who sins has either seen him or known him. Now, if you take this as a uh, one and done all things, then you're kind of missed the point a little bit here. Is that sin is not certain actions. Sin isn't individual only. No, sin is a lawlessness. It's so we see this all the time, right? We see bullies or we see people who are flagrantly breaking the law, and you can say, well, they have a life, an idea, a philosophy, whatever, that the law doesn't apply to them. We're seeing that in government right now, right? That's lawlessness. That's sin. The fact that, you ran a red light or you messed up on something, or even more importantly, that you're uh, LGBTQ or you're especially trans. I mean, I don't know how people can say trans people are full of sin or living in sin. It's just ridiculous. You can't do that. You can't even do that by Torah. And you certainly can't do that by intent, right? Big deals about that. But the thing is that it's the lawlessness, it's the pattern of behavior that is the sin. Big, really big importance there. And because people who say, codify it into a particular theology, especially very punitive theology like penal substitutionary atonement or this idea that God's wrath must be satisfied, in to cover sins. Um, Yeah, I mean, technically, yeah, because Jesus basically releases us from the law. That's how that works. Jesus released us and in the new covenant from the law. So, one of the things I found really interesting is that this young gentleman and another person, when I was talking about John Piper, who is 5 point Calvinist, the desiring God guy, the guy that talks like Jonathan Edwards, loves Jonathan Edwards, as if that's real theology for us today. Um, Clearly a dominionist, right? Because he wants the things to be run biblically in according to him, right? So Piper uh, talks about this a lot, where he talks about how the law is uh, you know, uh, part of that dispensation, that earlier law was then by us breaking it, by us having original sin and so forth, that Jesus came to satisfy the wrath of God that was set up through the law. A lot of inconsistencies, a lot of problems with that. The thing uh, that I agree with is that yeah, Jesus does release us from the law with the new covenant, with the idea that all law is can be summed up in the one command of love your neighbor as yourself, something that all of us believe in one way or another. But the thing is that once you say you go released, then people like Piper will come back in and just mercilessly apply the law. They'll go pick what they want out of the Torah. They'll try to justify it in misapplication of the New Testament, particularly Romans, and just like I mentioned, how they did it um, with the Sermon on the Mount. If you can pick things out of the most graceful part of all the Gospels, the Sermon on the Mount, and use it as a way to beat up your, people you don't like, I mean, that's just complete, I don't know, lawlessness. It's wrong. But anyway, that's what they do. And that's what I really object to is that they say you're released from the law, or the law has been fulfilled in Jesus, and then they come right back and they cherry pick and pick the bits of the law to use against you. You notice how it's never against them. They'll say it's against them. Oh, I'm the biggest sinner and all that nonsense, that they pick out from Paul, misunderstanding it and realizing, oh, well, that's false humility so that I can beat up on you because the law applies to me too. Well, that's very often used against people who are vulnerable, who are mistreated, especially gay people, especially trans people nowadays. That is used all the time. This idea that the law doesn't apply to me because I'm not like you. Now, the law generally applies to me, but I'm going to pick out these couple of laws and use them as a weapon against you. That's what we see here. The new covenant releases us from that. The new covenant means that the law is love your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. It says that over and over again. I just mentioned, Jesus says that, but it also in Galatians 5:14. You have to understand also what Paul's intent is in saying that here in Galatians. It's the same reason that Paul uses it in Romans. The Galatians and the Romans had the same problem, and that was they had um, Jewish converts to Christianity that wanted to keep the rigidness of the Torah and use it against people who weren't like them, namely Gentiles. So they were saying, and you basically have to become as pure and wonderful as we are, even though, we're washed in the blood of Christ and all that stuff. But you have to become like us in order to be an acceptable Christian. Sound familiar? Both Galatians and Romans. So it's really ironic. It's really horrible, actually, that Romans, especially chapters 1 through 5, and portions of Galatians are used to beat up on people, to make them say, no, well, yeah, you're washed in the blood of Christ. Yeah, Jesus released you from the law, except for the things that I choose to use against you. So that's why Galatians 5:14 just says, that's not the way it is. Actually, when you read Romans in totality, that's not the way it is either. It's about the release from the law, and that we have the law written on our hearts, as it says in Romans 2:15 about the Gentiles. They had the law written on their hearts, as it says in uh, um, or as it says in Hebrews 10. It also says that written on our hearts. It says that all the laws can be summed up in one law: love your neighbor as yourself. Why is that so hard for people to get? That's the gospel story right there, is that the replacement of the letter of the law with the intent of the law. So that's why Jesus is this pivotal person. This is why Jesus is the Christ, because he is the bridge between the written law and the obsolescence of the old covenant and the law of the heart, the new covenant. I just wish that more people understood that. So when you hear about religion being punitive, hard, difficult, you're not measuring up, that we need to crack down on people, especially in our government and in our society, this is what you're hearing. Is you're hearing Jesus is insufficient, and that we still need some of the law in order to be able to crack down on people and control them. It's all about control. People say lots of things about the Bible, especially when it comes to the law and the forgiveness of sins, what a sin is, all of those things that aren't really there. And they use the Bible for control instead of for grace. With that, I say, God bless you.